Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk about organizing your speech and the different types of organizational patterns that you have at your disposal to think about how best to organize your speech, both for yourself as well as for your audience. Before we get to those different organizational patterns, let's think for a minute about why does organization matter in the first place? Have you ever listened to a speech that's not organized? What's the problem with that? Well, there are lots of different problems. The first thing is you, as the speaker, have a hard time remembering because everything is confused in your head. If you're very organized in the way that you put out the information, it's going to be easier for you to remember it and to still be fluid and fluent in the way that you convey the information to your audience. From the audience perspective, if your speech is not organized, they're going to have a harder time following it. And if they can't follow it, it's easier for them to get confused or frankly bored. And if they decide that they can't pay attention, then it's easier for them to start not paying attention and not necessarily giving you the opportunity to get them to gain the information that you're looking to them to gain in order to help you with your speech. So what we're going to do today is talk about the different organizational patterns and when's the appropriate time to use them so that as you think about putting your speech together, you can decide what's going to work best for you. So let's go ahead and get started. So here are the different patterns of speech organization. You can see there are 9 of them. Spatial, starting from the top left, you have spatial, problem solution, comparative advantages, Monroe's motivated sequence, topical, narrative, causal, problem cause solution, and chronological. And each one of these patterns serves a different purpose depending on what kind of a speech you have that you're trying to convey to your audience. So we're going to go through each one. I'm going to share an example with you. And then at the end, we're going to talk about which one works better, whether you're trying to just inform your audience and give them information and facts, or if you're really trying to persuade them and getting them to do something differently than they otherwise would have done. So the first one is topical. This one is actually the easiest. It's just presenting the information in terms of topics. So if your purpose statement was to explore the potential of alternative energy sources as a substitute for fossil fuels, what might be your 3 main points? Well, they might be by topic. In other words, they might be 3 kinds of alternative energy sources. So you might have wind power, solar power, and geothermal. So this works well as a catch-all pattern when no other pattern really works well. So another example would be if you're introducing someone and you're going to be talking about different hobbies that this person has. Maybe they like to play video games, they like to play baseball, and they like to listen to music. Then that would fall into a topical organization. Each one of those is a different hobby that this person may have. So that's topical. The next one we're going to look at is chronological, which, just as the name suggests, is in order of timeline. So, for example, if your purpose statement is to provide a brief history of the civil rights movement in America, if you're going to go in chronological order, that would be a chronological pattern. So you might start with the early proclamation period, the early period beginning with the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation. Then you might have the rise of the Jim Crow laws in the South. Then you have the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education. And then lastly, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which was a pivotal moment in the history of the civil rights movement. So you see there at the bottom that it's going in an order of chronology by time. And anytime you do this, then a good pattern to use would be chronological. Another example is spatial. Now, spatial, even though the example here is about space, does not necessarily mean that it's about space. It just means that the pattern of your speech is organized in terms of where it's physically located. So this example is to inform you about the 4 layers of the atmosphere closest to the Earth. And you have, of course, the 4 layers, the troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, and thermosphere. So you see here that it's going from the outside in. You can also go from the inside out. Some other examples where the spatial pattern might be helpful is when you're talking about a building. So if I were to talk about the Eiffel Tower in Paris, for example, and I would start with the base and then discuss the middle piece and how that was formed and then get to the very top and the spire, that would also be spatially located. If I was talking about bodies and I was starting at the top and looking at the chest and then going down to the legs and then getting down to the feet, that would also be spatially located. It doesn't also have to be physical. If I was talking about the United States of America and the 50 states, there are different ways that I could do it, right? I could do it chronologically by starting with the first state and then moving on, Or I could do it spatially, starting with the West Coast, moving to the middle of the country, and then moving over to the East Coast. So spatially is really where and how that place or that person or that thing is physically located and going from that perspective. The next one is causal. Causal is exactly what it sounds. If the purpose statement is to identify the causes of suicides, then of course the main points would be the different causes of suicide. So maybe depression, psychosis, and substance abuse. You have to be careful with causal and even some of the other patterns, because if you don't recognize it, it might look a lot like topical, but oftentimes it's something other than topical. Remember, topical you use if you can't really find any other way to fit that pattern of organization. It's the easiest, but it's also the most mediocre in a way. If you can find another pattern, it works better. So make sure that you don't confuse when it looks like topical, that it's not just topical. Here it can look that way, but you realize that according to the purpose statement, which is to identify the causes of suicide, this is actually the 3 different causes, which make it a causal pattern. The next one is, apparently there's a 4th main point, the desire to end one's agony and terminal illness. Remember, you can have as many main points as you want. I generally like to do 3, especially for those of you we're going to have shorter speeches this semester. So 2 to 3 main points is probably all you're going to have time for. But even in a longer speech, if you have too many main points, it's going to be harder for the audience to remember. The next one is problem solution, which again is exactly what it sounds like. If your purpose statement is to argue for improvements in campus parking, if you're using a problem solution pattern, you're first going to show the audience what the problem is, and then you're going to advocate for the solution that you think works best. So in this case, the problem is that campus parking is an increasingly significant problem. Well, that's a little tautological. I might have my problem be a little bit clearer. So the problem is that because there's not enough space for people to park on campus, then students don't have the opportunity and end up spending a lot of money trying to find parking in other areas. So what's the solution? There are several potential solutions, and then you might argue for whichever one you think might be best. So you might say one solution is to give everyone free subway cards. One is to increase the campus parking so there are more parking spaces, and maybe you have another one. The other one is problem cause solution. Now, if you look back, this one is problem solution. So the only difference between problem solution and problem cause solution is this one gives you the cause in the middle. So here, if the purpose statement is to encourage anyone with sleep deprivation to shut off all electronic devices, what is the problem based on this purpose statement? Yeah, it's sleep deprivation, right? The fact that you're not sleeping is the problem. What's the cause? Well, the cause are the electronic devices. And what's the purpose statement? What's the solution? The solution is to shut them all off. So right there in the purpose statement, you have the problem, the cause, and the solution. And as you put it together for your speech, you're just going to go in that order. So the problem is sleep deprivation being a national crisis. The enticement of electronic devices is a major cause of sleep deprivation, and the solution is to declare a moratorium on all uses of electronic devices at least 1 hour before bedtime. I'm still trying to follow that rule myself. I'm not always as good at it as I should be, but I do know that this is true. So this is the problem cause solution pattern. This one I tend to like better than just problem solution, because oftentimes, if we understand why something is happening rather than what is happening, it's easier for us to be persuaded that we need to figure out how to solve for it. The next one is comparative advantages. So comparative advantages is exactly what it sounds like. You're comparing the advantages and maybe disadvantages of something or 2 things or more than 2 things. So if, for example, I'm arguing that community colleges offer advantages over 4-year colleges for first and second year students, I'm then going to give a comparative advantage of community colleges versus 4-year colleges. So number 1, they're less expensive. Number 2, the professors emphasize teaching and not research. And number 3, the best professors teach first and second year students, unlike at most 4-year colleges. So there are a couple different ways to do it. This is one way to do it. The other one is to just give pros and cons of different things. If I want to talk about the differences between let's say an iPhone and an Android, I could use comparative advantage pattern to just talk about what the Android phones have and what the iPhones have. So instead of just purposely arguing for one over the other, I just show two of them and talk about what they each have as pros and cons. The next one is Monroe's motivated sequence. This one we're going to look a lot more closely at as we get into the persuasive speeches, so I'm going to briefly talk about it now. This one you'll see often used in advertisement. People use it all the time to persuade you to do things. And there are 5 steps. So we're going to talk about each of those steps and what they are. So let's say that the purpose statement is to advocate increased regulation of our food production. I'm going to go through all 5 of them and then I'm going to come back. So attention step is the personal story of harm or death of a friend or family member afflicted with foodborne illness. So the first step in Monroe's motivated sequence is the attention step, the hook, the attention getter. How do you get the audience to recognize, oh, this is something that I want to pay attention to? In this case, this person used a personal story to show the importance of talking about increasing regulation of food production. The next step is called the need step. You see here 48 million Americans get sick from foodborne illnesses each year, and 128,000 are hospitalized and 3,000 die, according to the CDC. So the need step is really nothing more than the problem, right? What is the need? What do we need to figure out? What is going on that needs to be solved? The third step is the satisfaction step. In this case, it's increased regulation by the Food and Drug Administration that would substantially reduce this epidemic. So in this case, the satisfaction step is nothing more than the solution. So right now, it looks very similar to problem solution, right? You have the hook, which you're always going to have anytime you have a speech because you want your audience to pay attention. You then have what's the problem, which is the need step, and then you have what's the solution, which is the satisfaction step. The one difference between the problem solution or the problem cause solution and Monroe's motivated sequence is this fourth step, which is the visualization step. Here you see, imagine not having to worry every time you buy food in a grocery store that it might be contaminated with a deadly bacterium. So the visualization step is actually getting the audience to consider what life would look like if the satisfaction step had been taken, if the solution step had happened. And then lastly is the action step. The action step is nothing more than, what are we going to do about this? Well, here in this case, it's sign the online petition to influence Congress to tighten regulation of the food industry. I mentioned that this happens oftentimes in advertisement. If you think about advertisement, you have the attention step is oftentimes somebody, maybe a famous person, being in the advertisement to try to get your attention. And then they talk about, oh, your hair or something is wrong. What do we need to do about it? Oh, look, if you use this product, it would make everything so much better. And then the visualization step that they use in advertisement is often like these before and after pictures. They show you like, oh, this is what my hair looks when it's all scraggly, and this is what it looks like once I've used this product. And of course, then the action step is go out and buy this product. So this is something that gets often used in advertisement as a way to influence the audience to buy their product. So that's Monroe's motivated sequence. As I said, we're going to talk more about it when we get to the persuasive part of the class. The next one is narrative. Narrative is nothing more than storytelling in a way. So if the purpose statement was to explain the influence of Otis Blackwell on the music industry, you have Blackwell's formative years affected his musical choices. Numerous legendary singers popularized his songs, and then he won numerous awards. Couple things to be aware of. This can very much look like topical, right? It could also sometimes look like chronological. So how do you know the difference? Well, it's not topical because it's still talking about the same thing according to the purpose statement, which is the influence of Otis Blackwell on the music industry. And it's not chronological because it's not necessarily going in exact order. One thing that does this a lot is Wikipedia. If you go to look up a biography in Wikipedia, it doesn't necessarily go in chronological order. It might say early years, career, personal life. So it has it more in terms of a story than it does in terms of chronological order. So that's the narrative. And that brings us to the end of all 9 of the patterns of speech organization. So let's think about now, as you're thinking about your own speeches, which of these are used for informative speeches, for persuasive speeches, or for both? So this is really helpful because right now when they're 9, you're thinking, wow, this is a lot to think of. but very clearly there's a delineation between which ones are used for which kinds of speeches. So if you're using informative, let's look at spatial. Does spatial work for informative? Remember, spatial is how it's physically located, right? Like either in terms of the Eiffel Tower or the United States of America. Is that going to be informative? Absolutely. I'm trying to explain to you how something is situated. Is it persuasive? Excuse me, probably not, right? You're probably not going to use a spatial organization to persuade people. Let's look at problem solution. Can that be informative? Here's the problem, here's the solution. If you're giving people a solution, then you're probably not informing them, you're also persuading them. So that is going to work better for the persuasive type of organization, persuasive speech. What about comparative advantages? Comparative advantages is one of the ones that can be either. Because if you remember my earlier example when I talked about the Android versus the iPhone, if I were just sharing them and saying, here are the pros and cons for the iPhone and here are the pros and the cons for the Android, then it's informative, right? I'm not telling you what to do about this. I'm just giving you the different information on both of these different technologies. If I were trying to convince you that the iPhone was better than the Android, then I would be using comparative advantage to persuade. So that's one of the patterns of speech organization that can be either informative or persuasive. Monroe's motivated sequence we just talked about is probably the most commonly persuasive use of speech organization, right? Because the whole point is to show you here's a problem, here's how to get you interested, here's the problem, here's the solution, here's you visualizing that solution coming to life, and then here's what to do about it. What about topical? Well, remember, topical is just giving topics. I think the examples I used were somebody's hobbies or talking about the different wind energies, the different, if I want to talk about the different types of, let's see if I was saying I was going to talk about a tsunami and I was going to talk about a tornado and I was going to talk about an earthquake, right? Those are topics. Those aren't necessarily anything I'm trying to persuade you about. So that would always be informative. Narrative as well would always be informative because you're telling a story. You're not really persuading people. Causal, interestingly enough, is generally just informative, even though it seems like it might be persuasive because you're not necessarily giving a solution. You're just talking about why something is happening. So if I explain to you, I think the example that was used here was suicide, that the causes of suicide in this country are these 4 things. I'm not telling you what to do about it. As soon as I told you what to do about it, it would become problem, cause, solution. But if I'm just talking about the causes without giving you a solution, then it's generally just informative. Problem, cause, solution is giving you a solution, so therefore it's persuasive. And chronological is just in order of how things happen without offering a solution, so therefore that too is informative. So notice that the word I keep coming back to is solution. Anytime you're offering solutions, you're telling people what to do or what is better, then it's going to be persuasive. And in these 9, that includes problem solution, Monroe's motivated sequence, problem cause solution, and comparative advantages. So there are really only 4 that will be persuasive, and the rest can all be informative. So that's it today to talk about speech organization. What I want you to do is think about, as you're preparing for your speech, which one you think is going to work best for your topic.